Now, to explore this issue and share her insights, we're delighted to welcome Beatrice Heuser, Professor of International Relations from the University of Glasgow. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Welcome, Professor. So I note that you are currently working on a research paper on the political dimensions and impact of military exercises. Now, bearing in mind, of course, that on the eastern flank of NATO and very recently in Belarus, we're seeing enormous numbers of military exercises. What does your research tell you so far about the political impact of these exercises?
Interestingly, they are a sort of virtual theatre of war. Basically, even though there are real wars going on in the world, military exercises are a way in which you can practice and rehearse war, and there are a whole series of different reasons or purposes to them. Obviously, purposes are to train your forces. They are to see if you can work together with allies. They are to train new military weapons, new weapon systems. But there's also an awful lot of political signaling going on in a military exercise. So with whom you conduct the exercise is very interesting. So, for example, the idea that you have Belarus and China working together on a military exercise puts a Far Eastern power right bang in the middle of Europe and suddenly signals that it is playing as a European power. China has absolutely no other reason to be in this area other than to back its ally Russia in its unlimited alliance, and thereby also Russia's proxy, Belarus. That's a very, very interesting political signal.
All right, speaking of political signaling, we also do see, for example, Finland, Sweden practicing with NATO extensively, and then, well, of course, like sooner rather than later, we know that Finland and Sweden officially joined the NATO alliance. And we are also seeing the kind of same theme going on with Ukraine now having a joint military training with Poland. There's even an establishment of training facilities in Poland. Do you think this is also a prelude, a political signal that NATO is finally ready to bridge Ukraine into the alliance?
It's a very strong political signal. When you said, is it a signal that NATO is willing to bring Ukraine into the alliance? It's more nuanced than that, of course. You've seen the NATO summit statement, which says that the path of Ukraine to NATO is irreversible. That's all very well, but still the path is a long one. It clearly isn't an immediate step towards the acceptance into NATO. In the alliance communique, it says that the NATO-Ukraine Council is a bridge towards such an accession, but there again, bridges can be very long, as you know about the bridge between Denmark and Sweden. This is something that is ongoing, and clearly coordinating, exercising with does not immediately confer NATO membership.
Right. Professor, I'd like to go back to the point you made about the Chinese troops exercising in Belarus. Now, there is talk in American quarters that Ukraine isn't really an American war, but surely that's not quite true, is it? Because the Asia-Pacific is definitely something that the United States is very concerned about, and China is also seen as a threat there. So isn't China basically throwing its hat into the ring and saying to America, actually, Ukraine is part of your problem?
Put it that way, it is in no way diplomatically subtle to engage in these exercises. It is very clearly done and designed to provoke feelings about China in the West, in NATO, in not only in America, but also in European NATO. So if the Chinese were seriously upset about the NATO communique that identifies them as a problem, well, in that case, they very directly provoked it. There's no other way of putting it. It's just interestingly to go back again to this question of what you're signaling with an exercise. You mentioned earlier Sweden very much involved with the alliance. Of course, Sweden is now an alliance member, but it is true that it actually exercised together with NATO for many years already. So basically, doing something like that is a very strong political signal, and it is quite hypocritical of China to say, on the one hand, that it is upset about being fingered as a problem for all of NATO, and at the same time very directly provoking such a reaction by these exercises.
Right, like I mentioned, these are, well, very unsubtle provocations when it comes to military drills with Belarus, and sometimes even really close to the Polish border even. So my question would be, why would they even bother wrapping it up at this point and calling it a counter-terrorist operation or whatnot?
Yeah, well, this is the bit where one should remember that there are many, many forms of military exercise. Think about it. In the Pacific Rim exercise that the United States has been leading for many years, China actually participated until not very long ago. So exercises can take many forms. When China participated in the Pacific Rim, it was obviously not in a very involved fashion. It was actually in a role of trying to relieve humanitarian disaster problems. So again, if you're focusing on terrorism, that is a very specific and very limited part on the spectrum of what you could do in a military exercise. China and Russia had exercises together in previous years on a larger scale, but again, experts were saying those were not very integrated exercises, in the sense that it was not necessary to share an awful lot of very secret information about the functioning of the Red Army of China or the Russian armed forces in order to conduct those exercises. You can have very different grades and degrees of integration in such an exercise, and particularly when you're concentrating on humanitarian relief or anti-terrorist operations, these are very circumscribed, very limited areas of cooperation.
Right. Moving on now, Professor, if we could, to the NATO summit itself. Both the UK and France were going to the summit fresh from national elections. The European parliamentary elections had just been held. The US elections are coming up. How did those dynamics, in the UK's case, a new government, a new prime minister, but the fact that, you know, they were facing political turmoil or turbulence, certainly at home, how did those dynamics influence what was being said in the back rooms, how the leaders got on with one another, how unified they were in their discussions?
Well, let's start with Britain. Britain is actually the most stable case of these, which is interesting after so many years of political turmoil in Britain. The Labour government has been preparing for taking power for quite a long time. It had a very clear shadow cabinet. The members of the shadow cabinet went straight into their positions with a lot of advice and a lot of preparation. So basically, that was a very smooth transfer of power and transition from one government to the other. So the British case was one which was extremely smooth, if you like. Now, on the French side, of course, President Macron knows all the leaders, or knew all the leaders in the room. Again, there was no particular question about his knowledge, his background. He knows everything, but it must have been very difficult for him to come across as very powerful and concentrated and in control of things after the elections that he called, which misfired very much and went very much in a direction that he didn't expect. So he's still in power. It wasn't presidential elections, it was parliamentary elections, but the government that he had put in power is only a caretaker government at the moment. It will only be there until the 18th of July. So for him, it is much more difficult to give a long haul or give a representative or a presentation of what is going to be done in the long time, which is very sad in a way, because in many respects, the purpose of this summit, you've probably seen it in commentaries, was to make NATO and the relationship between NATO and Ukraine Trump-proof, as one commentator has put it, and as other commentators have echoed since. And the making it Trump-proof means that really the European member states of NATO must buckle up and must be much more forthcoming in their own cooperation and indeed leadership. And if anybody in Europe can take leadership, it would be France and the United Kingdom. Now, the two of them working together could be a very good deal, but it is not helpful that Macron is so weakened at this particular point. He must have put on a very good show, from all we know, at the summit in Washington, but at the same time, he must have felt very weakened in his own position at home.
Speaking of feeling very weak, we also saw the performance of Biden, and there's really no sugarcoating it. A lot of commentators have been saying that he has a little bit of visible decline. Now, politics aside, do you think a lot of these, Macron seeming weak, Biden seems to be not like up to the task, will that also factor in the discussion? And do you think there's any dynamics that might emerge out of that?
I don't think that there was a lot of dynamics going on at Washington at the summit itself. I think the meeting was very scripted. And as we all know, the summit declaration was prepared weeks and if not months in advance by diplomats sitting around a table and working out every nuance of every sentence and haggling over every single phrase. So the summit communique was well prepared, and I doubt that there were even at Washington any last minute changes or last minute agreements that were necessary over any disagreements about the text. So basically what comes out of the summit is something that has been long prepared for and is not just fixed at the summit itself. I imagine that given the very great heterogeneity of the positions of somebody like you've just got on screen, of course, just now you had Viktor Orban and everybody really disagreeing with him and his particular posture. I don't think that there was much of a rallying or getting together or trying to plot for the future in this particular summit. I doubt that there was much going on behind the scenes that will lead to any innovations or big new steps.
Right. Now, I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about NATO generally and its response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. After the Berlin Wall came down, there was much talk of a peace dividend, and NATO seemed to be in a bit of a slumber, didn't it? I mean, most countries weren't paying their 2% that they'd committed to. They weren't expecting any aggression and so on. Did the Russian invasion basically rejuvenate NATO and give it a cause once more?
Rejuvenation that we all wish hadn't been necessary, but yes, of course it has. And NATO was, of course, very, very relieved to find that there was no longer this Cold War threat of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, and NATO did indeed go into a slumber. It did indeed go onto the back burner with its activities in many respects, turning towards resolving the issues in Yugoslavia and then other out-of-area issues, which means particularly in the 1990s and the early 2000s, there were no exercises for any major war. So it's really only since 2014 that very gradually NATO has got back to a posture where it contemplates a major war and it contemplates how it has to fight it. So by now we have a new generation of NATO documents, the strategic defense documents, and documents that show how strategy can be declined down to operational levels and what this actually means for an eventual use of force if NATO territory itself is attacked. But as you've also seen from the NATO summit and from all sorts of other activities in NATO, there are many plans now emerging about what NATO can do to be a backup to Ukraine and to support Ukraine through greater arms production in NATO countries and deliveries of material for the Ukrainian forces. So NATO has indeed been revived, shall we say, rather than rejuvenated. I think rejuvenated sounds far too positive here, and is now very active in its defense planning and in its plannings for the support of Ukraine.
Right, thank you for that, Professor. Now, in the last minute or so that we have left, just a very quick response, if you would, please. Article 5 is something that people always talk about when it comes to NATO's Mutual Defence Pact. But I was looking at the wording of the article, and it says that basically NATO allies will take the actions it deems necessary to assist the ally which has been attacked. Isn't that a bit of a loophole? So, for example, can you not imagine Hungary, if a NATO member was attacked by Russia, can you not imagine Hungary saying, well, what we deem is necessary is some helmets and some blankets?
Excellent question, and you are spot on. This is a terrible loophole that the US Senate and Congress insisted on putting in. The original text that was put to them was one in which there was a completely unlimited commitment to the defense of each other. And Hungary would be in a pickle, in fact, if that happened, because while the NATO Article 5 has that loophole, Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty of the European Union has no such loophole and is a completely unconditional commitment to the defense of other countries, to the point of a reduction of the sovereign right of member states to decide not to defend each other. So Hungary would still be in a great pickle if it opted out. It would be in breach of treaty.
Understood. Thank you very much, Professor. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you very much for your insights. Have a good evening.
Thank you.